Let's go. And it appears that we are officially live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another session of our Sussex Vision Seminar Series, as always, within the Worldwide Neuro Initiative. I'm George Kafedis, a master's graduate from Thomas Euler's group, and currently a PhD student with Tom Baden. And as your host for today, I would like to once again begin by thanking Tim Vogels and Panos Bozelos for putting forward this ever-expanding initiative towards a greener and much more accessible seminar world. Having said that, allow me, of course, to get back to the reason we all gathered here for today and introduce our guest from Simmons Foundation and Flatiron Institute, Professor Dmitri Chklovskii. Before transitioning to neuroscience, Mitya studied theoretical physics and got his PhD from MIT. As a postdoctoral fellow, he first joined Bertrand Halperin at Harvard and then moved as a Sloan Fellow to Salk Institute and the lab of Charles Stevens. In 1999, he became a professor at Stony Brook University and founded the first computational neuroscience group at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. During his time there, he developed statistical models of cortical circuitry that unveiled links between neuronal function and neuronal structure. Later, as a group leader at Janilia, and among other projects of his, Mitya pioneered the creation of connectomics pipelines for reconstructing the visual system of Drosophila. And in 2014, he moved to New York, where he has been located ever since, if I'm not mistaken, nowadays as a professor at New York University Langone Medical Center and the group leader of neural circuits and algorithms at Flatiron Institute. In his group, they are broadly interested in modeling neural computations by combining structural and functional data with an increasing focus lately on data-driven control theory. So today we have the pleasure of hearing about their latest and I'm sure exciting findings in his talk entitled Reimagining the Neuron as a Controller, a novel model for neuroscience and artificial intelligence. So without any further ado from my side, please all welcome Professor Chklovskii. Mitya, the stage is officially all yours.
Thank you very much, George, for this very kind introduction and the invitation, of course. I'm thrilled to be here, and I think you should be able to see my first slide now in the presentation mode. I'm planning to talk to you about reimagining the neuron as a controller, hoping to establish this as a new model for neuroscience and AI. And because I've been told that my last name is difficult to pronounce, you can find here a pictogram that should help you along. All right, so let's get started. So when I switched to neuroscience about 25 years ago, the prevailing view of how to think about the brain function was that the brain was an input-output device, right? So the brain receives sensory inputs from various modalities. Visual neuroscience at that time was perhaps the most advanced, and then based on those inputs, the brain somehow infers what is happening in the world and decides on the most appropriate course of action, thereby producing behavior. This, I think, would be fair to say, has been the mainstream approach in neuroscience for a long time, but I remember very clearly that it was a big revelation for me to realize that this is only part of the story. And it is crucial to realize that the brain is not just a feed-forward device, but it exists in a loop with the environment. That it doesn't just generate action, but also observes the effects of its action on the environment, thereby closing the loop between the sensation and the action. And this is, of course, in the motor control field, very well known. It's a sensory motor loop, but in the sensory neuroscience, it wasn't widely used. Of course, because part of this was an illusion that vision is a passive sense. And now we know, of course, that that isn't quite the case, that saccades and microsaccades are active movements that play an important role in vision, and also in other modalities. For example, in somatosensation, in rodent whisker sensing, it is very clear that if the rodent doesn't move its whiskers, it doesn't sense anything. And the same, of course, applies to the eyes. So then it is clear that there is this sensory motor loop that is central to our understanding how the brain works. So what we did, we took this understanding of how the brain works a step further and applied it to the basic building units of the brain, which are neurons. So again, the traditional view of neurons is that it's an input-output device that converts its inputs, which are synaptic currents received because of the spikes in the upstream neurons, and then somehow integrates those spikes to produce an output spike that travels down the axon, and that's the output that influences other neurons. And just like what I told you about the brain as a whole, we realized that a neuron exists in a loop with the environment. What is the environment for a neuron? Well, it's mostly other neurons that are synaptically connected to it. It could also get into the external environment, of course, but the basic idea is the same. If you think about a neuron as an efficient coding device or a predictor of its input, that's not maybe the whole story, because by existing in the loop, the neuron has an opportunity to influence its environment and observe the results of its influence in its inputs. And thereby, it can drive or attempt to drive the environment to some kind of preferred state, thereby being a controller. So that's the basic message that will try to convey to you today. And the way I will do it, I will first explain how it is possible that a neuron can perform this job. And second, derive a bunch of predictions of various seemingly unrelated physiological facts that all naturally fall out of this framework. I'm going to make a short pause to check with George if there are any questions in the chat.
Thanks, Mitya. No, there are no questions appearing. I can let you know if some appear later on.
All right. Well, don't hesitate, because I want to also be part of the feedback loop, and it's important for me to get a feedback to my talk online. All right. So here is the traditional view of the neuron, which is, again, analogous to the input-output view of the whole brain. And this has been inspired by the neuroscience understanding of 80 or 70 years ago, and got canonized even by classics like McCulloch, Pitts, Rosenblatt, and others, and served as a foundation of artificial neural networks. And in fact, these days, when you use large language models, ChatGPT, and so on, this is exactly the same unit that exists under the hood. So it hasn't changed a bit. But I think that the neuroscience knowledge has progressed over this 80 years, and it is clear by now that the neurons, most of the neurons, exist in loops. How do we know that? Well, first of all, from anatomy, paired recordings initially, and now connectomics results tell us that the majority of neurons are parts of loops of various lengths, 2 neuron loops, 3 neuron loops, 4 neuron loops, and so on. And so there is a potential anatomical path from an output of a neuron to its inputs. Okay, now that this path exists, what can happen with it? Well, once we have a loop like this, the appropriate framework to analyze it is called the control theory. And in the control theory, basically what they do, they say, okay, well, suppose the environment of the neuron, well, they call it the plant, it doesn't matter, has a certain model of the dynamics. Here, for simplicity, I'm using a linear dynamical description of the environment with a discrete time formalism, just to be concrete. And A is a matrix. So X is a vector that represents the state of the environment. A describes the evolution of the state autonomously. And then the second term, U, is the output of the neuron that can influence the dynamics of the environment through the coupling described by the vector B. So that's basic model of the environment. And we assume that the goal of a neuron is to somehow control the environment to get X into some reference state. For most of this talk, I will assume that the goal is simply to stabilize the environmental dynamical system. It's not the only objective function, of course, and we are trying to find other ones, but this is a necessary condition, of course, because if the stability is not ensured in the loop, it will just explode. So in control, stability is job number one, and that's what we will do as well. How can stability be achieved? How can vector X be driven to zero? Well, under some condition, for example, quadratic loss functions, it's known that the control is a linear function of the state. It's the optimal control is given by W, which is some matrix multiplying X gives the control U. And then the goal of the controller is to compute the optimal W that will achieve this goal. So that's what we hypothesize the job of a neuron is. Now, at this point, I think you might have some questions because, well, okay, a framework like this has been used for the brain, even for parts of the brain like cerebellar nuclei and so on, but no one has proposed anything like that for a single neuron. And I think there is a clear reason why, because to perform this control task is actually computationally rather challenging. I say computationally because in principle, it's known how to do this, at least for the linear dynamics. You can open a control theory book and it will tell you how to do this. Well, first of all, we cannot expect a neuron to know exactly the dynamics of the environment at any given moment because it's nonlinear and it's time varying. So linear dynamics is only approximation that is valid for a short time. And the neuron doesn't know the parameters A and B. So the first thing that a controller has to do is to infer A and B from the data, which are control signals U and observations X. And that's called systems identification. It's known how to do this for linear dynamics, and you can open up a textbook and find a formula and plug in the data, and out comes A and B. Once you've figured out A and B, you want to compute optimal control for this model of the dynamics of the environment. And then again, you can say, well, I minimize the quadratic loss in the objective X squared and the control energy U squared, and then you find the optimal W. And finally, it is possible that the system is not fully observed. That is, the controller doesn't have access to the full state X, but observes a lower dimensional projection of X, which is usually the case. And in that case, the control cannot be performed in terms of that projection because this doesn't really tell you what the state is. Many possible states can have the same projections. So you need to infer the state first to write down the control. This is also known how to do, and all those three steps are known, but computational intensive because they require solving equations, including matrix multiplications, matrix inversions, and so on. So rather tricky operations. So for little neuron with its limited biological hardware, I think it's hard to imagine how it can even represent the dynamics of the environment in terms of A and B, let alone compute these three steps needed for control. And that's why I think people did not think that a neuron could serve as a controller, even though most neurons are parts of loops. So what changed, and why am I giving you this talk today, is because about 20 years ago, a new framework was developed in control theory that simplified this process immensely, and this is called the direct data-driven control. And basically what they did, they said, well, let's skip the intermediate step. Let's not reconstruct explicitly the model of the environment, say, described by the parameters A and B. What we really don't need it, right? Because the goal of the control is to go from the observations X to the control signals U. And we can do this by learning this mapping from the past pairings of X and U. Because a neuron has a history, it generated some control in the past, and it observed the effects of this control through X. So this is the data that can be used to learn the correct mapping W. And that can be done bypassing the intermediate step of explicitly building the model of the environment. And in fact, it turns out that the solution to this direct data-driven control is simpler, just computationally simpler. And what we're going to show can be implemented by biological hardware, even in a single neuron. So that's the basic message here, that once you adopt this direct data-driven control framework, then this can be done on the level of a single neuron. And moreover, the algorithms that come out of it map onto neuronal physiology that we all know and love. So at this point, I'll make a little break again to ask George if there are any more questions.
There are no questions appearing yet, but I have one of my own, Mitya. So going back to the parallel that you made with the organism being in a loop with the environment, when the organism moves, you know what changes in the environment is because of your movement, right? And what actually changed in the stimulus. At the case of the neuron, can you really tell what is because of the feedback of your own control and what is novel sensory input?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And of course, what I'm presenting here is an oversimplification because in real life, there are two causes to the observations. One is the cause from the controllable part of the system that is shown here, and another is a cause by the uncontrollable part of the environment, right? So like I said, in the senses, okay, well, you move your eyes with the microsaccades to induce visual motion that the one can be registered by the retina. And so most of the motion that the retina sees is from self-motion. But there could be a car driving by in your visual view, and that is not caused by your own actions. And that is registered just as well. And so this is this uncontrollable part of the input. And so basically, even though it's not part of the loop, it can be compensated by the control signals that are part of the loop. And I think the most familiar example of that working is noise reduction headphones. So if you ever use noise reduction headphones, that's exactly what they're doing. They have a feedback loop there, right? And then there is an external environment that your headphones do not control, right? Someone is shouting, there's airplane, engine noise, whatever, okay? But the feedback loop in your headphones is compensating for those external inputs that are uncontrollable, okay? Of course, if what comes in from the outside is a white noise and unpredictable, there's nothing you can do. So this is only possible if the external uncontrollable part has correlations that can allow you to predict it in the future. Okay? Does that answer your question? All right, excellent. So I just put in a plug for this direct data-driven control that is so simple and it's going to save the world. So let me tell you on the simplest possible example how that direct data-driven control works. And this will lead actually us to the first big prediction, which will explain the spike timing dependent plasticity kernel in synaptic plasticity rules. Okay, so this is our loop with a neuron in it. And in this case, we model the environment with the simplest possible model where the state is described not by a vector, but by a scalar. So xt is just a scalar, and it evolves in time based on this factor a, which can be greater than 1, leading to instability. So xt increases exponentially by itself. And the goal of a neuron, we hypothesize, is to suppress this instability and stabilize the system using this control term BUT. Of course, to do that correctly, we need to compute the appropriate control law, which can be written as a linear function of the input, where W has a natural interpretation of a synaptic weight. Of course, this is like really spherical cow model of a neuron with a single synaptic input, but that's sufficient to explain what this does. Okay, so how do we compute appropriate W? Well, in a dynamical system this simple, you can stabilize it, that is, drive x to 0 in a single time step. So you can require that for any xt observed by the neuron, it generates ut that drives xt plus 1 to 0. And then if we plug in the control law from the synapse in here, we express xt plus 1 in terms of xt, and that requirement to have xt plus 1 equals 0 for any xt results in the requirement for w, which is equal to minus a over b. And that's it. If the neuron knew the right w, which is minus a over b, it could manage to stabilize this unstable environment in one step, and the problem would be solved. And that's how things were done in the traditional control theory. They give you A and B, and they ask you to compute what the W should be, and that's the result of your computation. Of course, this is the oversimplified case. Usually, A and B are matrices, and then, it gets difficult and so on, but that's basically the idea, okay? So W is minus A over B, and xt plus 1 is 0 for any xt. Problem solved, right? Well, except that, as we discussed, in biology, it's unrealistic to expect for the neuron or the synapse to know either A or B. Therefore, it cannot solve the problem just by computing W using this formula. And this is exactly where direct data-driven control comes in. So the direct data-driven control, I said it's a very simple framework, but it requires a different way of thinking. So it might take a little bit of adjustment. So I will explain it in two ways. First, geometrically, and then algebraically, okay? So geometrically, this is the relevant diagram. So what we did here is the following. If you look at the dynamics equation, right, there are three variables here, xt, ut, and xt plus 1. And so we can introduce a three-dimensional vector that lives in a three-dimensional space whose components are those three variables, okay? And this is the space I'm showing to you on the right. However, because the dynamics is described by this equation, it doesn't allow this vector to live anywhere in this space, but only in the subspace dictated by this linear equation. And that subspace is shown here by blue, and that's the plane, a two-dimensional subspace, which is determined by the coefficients A and B in this equation. So all the valid triplets, xt plus 1, xt, and ut, must live in this plane. Well, of course, the neuron doesn't know where this plane is, but it can learn where that plane is by previous observations of this vector. So if it has seen before some value of xt plus 1, and ut that is determined by this vector, this blue vector here, then it knows that the plane has to pass through that vector. If the controller has seen another triplet described by this vector, then it knows that the plane has to pass through that vector. So for a plane, knowing these two vectors is already enough to define its location. And once you know where the plane lies, you can find the intersection of that plane with the xt plus 1 equals 0 plane, which is the equilibrium point that we are trying to achieve. And then you can compute the correct control signal ut by measuring xt at that point. So that's now online, okay? And then building up to that red intersection line, and then projecting down to ut. And that's the correct value of ut that one has to use, the controller has to use to drive the system to 0, which is exactly what has been done in the model-based control. But note that we avoided even the mention of the parameters A and B. And so what we did, we took the previous data described by the blue vectors, we constructed the blue plane that is spanned by those vectors. And then we found the intersection of that blue plane with the xt plus 1 equals 0 plane. And that allowed us to compute the optimal control signal ut. I'll briefly pause for questions.
So still there are no questions appearing in the chat, but I have another one of my own. So I guess this depends on the temporal window that you allow for feedback, right? Would this temporal window, like its length, its size, would be the same irrespective of the current state or the control you provided? Or can this dynamically change as well, like the integration history, let's say?
That's a really good question. And that temporal window is a really important parameter that we will address in the second half of the talk. For now, because the system is so simple, there is nothing happening beyond one time step. Because the dynamics is scalar, there is no other parameter that can determine the length of this window. So in this case, it's just one time step. But in real life, it will be extended. Exactly. Okay, so this was the geometric picture. Now let's move on to the algebraic description of the same thing. And that's based on this mathematical fact that any valid triplet of variables xt plus 1, xt, and ut can be represented as a linear combination of previously seen triplets with some unknown coefficients g. So basically, this is like basis decomposition, except that this is not, on the right, this is not really basis. It's more like a frame. It's overcomplete. The vectors are not orthogonal. But if they fully span the dynamic subspace, this blue plane, then you can represent any vector as a linear superposition of previously seen vectors that span the plane. So that's the algebraic expression of the same fact that I told you about geometrically. And so that will allow you, again, to find out the optimal control by solving the system of equations. This mathematical expression is so simple, and it's actually surprising that it's really that powerful. But because it is, it was given a name. It was called the fundamental lemma of Willems et al., based on the paper they wrote. And the reason it even has this name is because what I just told you is actually not always true. If you recall linear algebra, it actually puts a requirement on what those vectors have to be to fully span the subspace. They have to be sufficiently diverse to cover all of the subspace. And mathematically, we can say that this row vectors are linearly independent, or this submatrix has full row rank. But the basic idea is that the vectors have to be like the blue ones on the right, because if two vectors that you used were collinear with each other, then you wouldn't be able to do it, because that doesn't define the plane. The plane has to pass through those vectors, but then the angle is undefined. So it will be flopping like a weather vane in the wind, and you wouldn't be able to find the correct intersection with the xt plus 1 0 line, and zero plane, and find the red line and find control. So that's why it's called the lemma. It says if there is a full row rank to the previous observations, then you can do this, and by extension, that will allow us to perform control. Okay, so that's basically it. That's the direct data-driven control. Now, you might be sitting there and wondering, wait, but you told us that direct data-driven control can be implemented by biological hardware. And how is a neuron supposed to solve the system of equations, right? What is it going to store all the previous trajectories, which are all these triplets, xt plus 1, xt, and ut? Where will it store it? And then it has to compute this unknowns g at every time step. There are a new set of g's, and then you have to use those g's to compute ut. And that's crazy. How can a neuron do that? And it turns out that actually, if you do a little algebra, the neuron actually can do it. And I'm going to spare you the details. There is a preprint on the web. You can look it up. But basically, the general outline is as follows. So we want xt plus 1 to be 0. That's our desideratum. That's the stability condition. So we put in xt plus 1 equals 0 here. And then xt is the actual measurement. And so what we want to compute is ut. That's our unknown that we want to figure out. But the problem is, of course, that all the g's are unknown. So how do we solve the system equation? Well, we first find the G's by solving the top two equations, okay? And then use the G's that we find to plug it into the last equation and then compute UT. Of course, the problem of learning G's is under constraint, so we look for minimum norm G, and that's like a linear regression, can be solved by pseudo-inverse. And once everything is said and done, we find that UT is indeed given by W times XT, where W is given by the expression here. Oops, sorry. W is given by the expression here, which basically depends on these two main sums. So the first sum is a covariance between X tau and U tau, and this is the activity of the neuron presynaptic to W, and U tau is the activity of the neuron postsynaptic to W, caused by X, right? Because UT is equal W times XT, even though their indices are the same, they're causally related. So this can be interpreted as a correlation between presynaptic and postsynaptic spike if the postsynaptic spike follows presynaptic. That's the only case where this sum is incremented over time, okay? And then if you look at the second sum, in the second sum, we look at the indices, and this is the covariance of which gets incremented only when the postsynaptic activity, UT, precedes the presynaptic activity. So this is kind of the anti-causal part. And when that happens, when that correlation happens, then that sum gets bigger. And that sum appears with a coefficient that is smaller than 1 and a minus sign. So now you may already guess why I'm making such a big deal out of it, because this kind of expression maps very nicely on the empirically discovered synaptic plasticity role called STDP, spike time independent plasticity. You probably all heard about it, but just to make sure we're on the same page, they stimulated the synapse by pairs of spikes and looked at how the time interval between those pairs of spikes, one was presynaptic, one was postsynaptic, changed the synaptic weight. And these dots are results of multiple experiments, and when they're all put together, they have these lines. And basically what happens is when the presynaptic spike precedes postsynaptic, this is this causal window, then the synapse gets stronger. That's the potentiation. And when the presynaptic spike follows the postsynaptic, that's this side, then the synapse gets weaker, that's depression. And so these two windows can be naturally mapped on the two sums in our expression. And that's why we claim that even the simplest direct data-driven controller explains something in physiology which has been observed and so well known, okay? Now, how big a deal is this? Well, it's nice that we got this result, but of course, I don't want to make too big of a deal of the exact, the fact that there is a minus and there is a beta, it's all nice. But the most important thing is that the controller view of a neuron explains this anti-causal part of the learning rule, which has been notoriously hard to explain. Because the causal part, the potentiation window, it's a Hebb rule, basically generalized to spike timing dependent case. But the depression part, especially the fact that the depression increases towards zero, was difficult to explain. And this explains it naturally. Why? Because what happens what does it mean that the presynaptic spike follows postsynaptic? It means that this neuron produced a spike, and that spike came out, and it went into the loop, and it affected the system. And then we assuming the goal was to shut it down, to drive xt plus 1 to 0. But instead, there was a spike that came back. That's the presynaptic spike following postsynaptic, that basically indicated that the control action has failed. Instead of shutting down the environment, it generated an action potential. And then it is an important learning signal that tells the synapse to get smaller here. So that part is explained rather naturally. And that's why we think it provides good evidence for the correctness of our view, because without having such feedback loop, it would be very hard to explain this anti-causal part. Of course, as a full disclosure, I should say, we did not explain all of the STDP curve. We don't give you the shape of this, right, potentiation and depression curves. All we did, we said, okay, there is this one-step delta functions of different magnitude with opposite signs. That's our approximation of STDP. That's all we did here. But also we couldn't really explain the shape, going back to George's question, because we have no parameter to explain this time window of feedback, because the dynamics is so simple. It's just a scalar variable, and there is nothing there to play with. So basically, I think we did as well as we could, but even such a simple model already explains a lot about STDP. I'll pause again in case there are any questions.
Thanks, Mitya. No, there are no questions appearing. If something comes up, I can, of course, let you know. But maybe also the audience wants to ask offline, like maybe they are shy to give you online feedback.
Right. Okay. Okay, very good. Okay, so we have this controller model that seems to map on spike timing dependent plasticity, but does it actually work? Would it be simulated on a computer? You know, what's going to happen? Is it really true? Will it actually work? The reason it's important to ask this question is because what I told you basically did not really work in the closed loop. We didn't really consider a closed loop scenario. Okay, so what if we do that? And initially, it seems to work. So if you look at the top diagram, what's shown here is how the weight W of the system for the scalar dynamics and quadratic loss adapts to the optimal one given by the dashed line. So dashed line is the optimal. And then the green line is one of the instances. And we have a few steps where we run the controller in the open loop. That means we generate U's randomly, and we look at the response. And you can look in the bottom plot, you can look what happens with the state. Okay, it's a little bit off, but once we have a few steps like that, then we learn the parameters, basically implicitly learning A and B, and then we learn the correct W, and then the system is stabilized, and the W is optimal up to time point 25. At 25, what we did, so that seems like the system works, right? Okay, great, it works. But then at 25, what we did, we changed the parameters of the system A and B, and so the optimal W now jumped to a different value. And then our W failed to adapt. It stayed the same. And we didn't really see anything bad because X is already 0, it's at equilibrium. X is 0, U is 0, so it doesn't matter that the dynamics change Nothing. No, the neuron didn't even notice at X state 0. Okay, so maybe it's okay that W is not optimal, but it's not really okay. And to really demonstrate it, we gave a little kick to the system, and time equals 55 by increment in X. And then what happened was that in the majority of cases, because the W was inappropriate, the system did not stabilize. And there was this runaway process where the cost became very, very big. And you can see this on the logarithmic scale. It was a disaster. And so that showed that by just learning the optimal W, the system lost its ability to adapt. And then we demonstrated it by the kick, and then we showed that the system took a very long time to actually restore itself. And by that, maybe dead or whatever. So why did this not work? What happened? So if we go back and analyze the system, we can see the reason for that. And that has to do with that condition that I told you about, the fundamental lemma, the full rank of the data matrix. Because once we learn the optimal W, it becomes constant. And then we plug in that expression for UT in our data matrix, and we see that the bottom two rows are not linearly independent. That means that the data vectors that were used to establish the blue plane are now collinear. They point in the same direction, and the plane is not defined. It can flop like weather vane in the wind, and then the system cannot adapt. So that's what happened, and that's why there is a problem with using this controller in an online closed loop setting. How can we fix that? Well, it turns out that there is a simple fix, which is already known, which is to add a little bit of noise, right? So our control law now is not just the optimal WX, but we also add noise to the controller. Of course, if we add a lot of noise, the control ceases to be optimal and it's useless. But if you add a little bit of noise, the control is still close to optimal. The loss that we suffer is not that great, but that restores the function of the controller. And that is shown in the right set of plots. That's the control law with the noise. And you can see that when W changed at t equals 25, then the controller adapted to that change in W. And then when there was a kick at 55, it took it a short time to come back to equilibrium and with much smaller loss. And you can see this very well here, that the loss was very insignificant and X came down to 0 very quickly. So,
Mitya,
yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. There's a question appearing in the chat from Toby Delbrook asking about the left side of your plots. Why does the green one go back? Like, why does it stabilize? I don't know if he's referring to the part of providing the current.
Yeah. It depends on the initialization. So what exactly the state the system is. And sometimes it may happen by accident that the system goes back to equilibrium, right? It just can always happen by chance. So we wanted to keep that in terms of full disclosure. Okay. All right. So the noise can rescue this problem with the data-driven controller. And the question is, well, what does it have to do with biology? And I think this is a very interesting parallel because in biology, noise is ubiquitous. And in fact, people have found it in many unexpected places. For example, it was thought that synapses were reliable at some point, but then it turns out that they're very noisy. that the probability of vesicle release on the presynaptic side is much less than 1 for any spike. And so there is this unreliability in every synapse. Why is it there? There are other examples, of course, that in C. elegans, there is an actual neuron whose job it is to inject noise in an otherwise reliable circuit for an avoidance response. Okay, and then in songbirds, there is a special nucleus that provides noise that is needed for learning, for adaptation. And of course, the escape response is fundamentally stochastic for obvious reasons. So noise and variability are everywhere in neuroscience. And what I'm trying to say here is that maybe this provides evidence that this data-driven control framework, actually what's going on, because the data-driven control framework requires existence of some noise and variability. Otherwise, it fails. Of course, not a proof, but it's another piece of experimental evidence that I think provides support to the idea that neurons are direct data-driven controllers. Should stop here in case there is another question.
No, you can continue, Mitya.
Okay, so the last part of the talk addresses this issue of more complex dynamics, right? So we modeled the environment as a scalar dynamical system before, but of course, this is unrealistic. The dynamics is more likely have a higher order, so X is a vector, but we will still have this spherical cow neuron with a single synaptic input, or the total synaptic current, as we will identify this with, that is scalar and represents a projection of that vector. So in this case, as I told you, the control has to be performed in terms of the inferred state vector x hat. It cannot be in terms of yt, because instantaneous measurement of yt gives you only one projection of the vector x, and you cannot control the system without knowing its state. So how can a neuron infer the state of the system? And it turns out that in this case, there's a very simple solution. All you have to do is to observe the system for a while and put together the measurements, the scalar measurements yt in this so-called lag vector, okay, where n has to be at least the dimension of the order of the dynamics of the latent. And for if the system was autonomous without b, then all you had to do is just to take this time delay embedding, so-called, and that would give you the inferred state. Of course, when the system is driven, if you do not include the driving signal u, you may misinterpret the meaning of those y's. So you also have to include those u's, because they could be the ones influencing the state of the system. But just this 2n dimensional vector is sufficient to characterize the state. Now you say, well, but how do you know that's exactly the state that is there? And the answer is that, well, you don't know. But actually the state, as control theorists would say, is unidentifiable, because you can make a linear transformation on the state, and in the cost of linear transformations of A and B that you don't see anyway, you will get the same predictions for the observations. So X hat is just as good as any other description of the state and can be used for control, okay? Now, how can it be used for control? Well, we already said that if the cost is quadratic, the control is linear. So we can compute the control by multiplying this inferred state by k, but we will now write down k in two parts. The first part multiplying the y, and because the y is the input, we'll call it the feed-forward part, k feed-forward, And the part that multiplies the U part of the vector will be K feedback, because that part gets the feedback or the afferent copy of the neuronal output, okay? And then that is also part of the control. And what we're going to do is we're going to change our tack. Instead of deriving the optimal control like we did in the part of STDP, we will not do that. Instead, we will compute the control law from the data, okay? So what we will do for that, we will disconnect the neuron from the loop, right? And then we will drive it with some input Y, for example, by the current injection into the soma. And then we will record the spike train of a neuron, and that will be U. And then we will create this data matrix shown here. That's the spike train, and this is the combination of the spike train and the injected current. And then we will solve this linear regression by pseudo-inverse, and we will find K-fit forward and K-fit back, okay? Of course, this is only a new interpretation. This procedure has been done a million of times in neuroscience, right? Because you can already recognize that this is just a decorrelated spike-triggered average procedure, right? Where you can compute the covariance or correlation between the output and the input of the neuron, and then you whiten it, okay? So we go back to this kind of measurements. This is the experiment that has been done many times. We're just reanalyzing the data, and then we inject the current, we record the spike train, and then we sum the current that preceded the spike and whiten it, and we get temporal filters like this. So this is K-fit forward, okay? Great. What have we learned? Well, our new interpretation tells us two things. First of all, we now understand why this filter has to be temporally extended, that the neuron cannot respond instantaneously because the total current at any given time doesn't give you the state of the environment. You need to know that state over time period to need to know the current over a certain time period to know the state of the system. And then you can decide to produce a spike. So that's why this temporal extended kernel exists. Also, it adapts, right? Depending on the relationship between the noise part and the bias, there is different shape of the filter. And that, of course, efficient coding will tell you that's a result of adaptation to efficient coding. And control would say the same thing. Depending on statistics of input, you would have a different filter. So that doesn't seem like there is too much here, this new interpretation. But the interesting thing begins when we looked at the feedback filter. And this is the computation of the feedback filter, which is simply the spike-spike correlation function, which tells you how likely the neuron is to spike after a previous spike. And you can see there is a big suppression. So it's unlikely to get a second spike after the first, which normally people would say, of course, there is a refractory period because the sodium channels need to deactivate and so on, okay? So that's the traditional explanation. But we can see that that shape actually adapts, okay? It's temporally extended and it adapts. And we can understand the temporal extension again because to reconstruct the state, the controller has to know the history of its own actions. Remember that U part of the state vector of the X hat. Okay, so that's what it is. It needs to know its own history of actions. And the reason there is a suppression, of course, is because it shouldn't overdo the control. Once it produced the spike, it has to wait for the effects of the spike in its inputs and then decide whether to spike again. Moreover, the efficient coding will not tell you for this filter to adapt. It would just a housekeeping process, right? Like deactivation and so on. But instead, we see it's adapting. In the control framework, of course, it should adapt, just like the feed-forward filter should be optimal for some statistics, the same with the feedback filter. So that's why we think it provides evidence for control. And one last experiment that I'm going to show is, again, has relevance to noise. And this is probably something that you all know, that neuronal spiking is a very, very precise process. And if you drive a neuron with the same current in every trial, you will produce exactly the same spike train, maybe with occasional dropouts. And that tells you that the spike generation mechanism is very exact, and very precise, which is probably physiologically, metabolically, or rather expensive. But this precision breaks down when you inject a constant current into a neuron. So from trial to trial, you inject the same step current, but the spikes happen at different times. So this precision breaks down. And of course, the direct data-driven control explains this immediately. It's the same problem that we observed before in STDP. It's the breakdown of this full rank condition, because if we were to invert the data matrix, it is now rank deficient, because these y's are all the same. And so these are all the same numbers. And then this doesn't have a full rank, and the DDC fails. And that's why we think there is variation. Of course, in reality, what happens, there is a little uncontrolled noise that goes into the neuron. So the experimenter is trying to inject a constant current, of course, but there is a little noise on top of it. And the exact instantiation of that noise probably determines the exact timing. And then the question is, well, but why is the timing so sensitive to that little noise? It was not on the left, right? Well, again, the DDDC framework explains it, because when you have noise, you cannot say X hat is rank deficient. Instead, it's ill-conditioned, right? Its ratio of top and bottom singular values is huge. And that's why, okay, when you invert it, you get huge sensitivity to the instantiation of the noise. So that, I think, provides another piece of evidence for the DDC. So to summarize, these are all the experimental observations that I brought up that I think follow from the direct data-driven control. And even though they seemingly unrelated to each other, but they all fall out from the same framework. Again, not a proof, but I think it provides some evidence that this controller framework has some value. So what's next? Well, you know, we just revised the model of a neuron from this instantaneously responding feed-forward device to this closed-loop controller with internal dynamics, but we haven't told you how to combine this together, because this is what I call external environment, is made up of other neurons, each of which thinks it's a controller, and it's controlling the rest of the world. So how to do that, we do not know. And that's a $1 million question, because if you figure it out, how to put together these little controllers so that they together perform a coherent action in a self-organized fashion, then that explains behavior. And then, of course, the consequences are huge, right? Because we can now run connectome-based simulations, we can model brain disorders, we can build better brain-computer interfaces. But also what I think is very tantalizing is that there is potential impact on AI, that, you know, this potentially will allow us to build neural networks with adversarial robustness from the bottom up, that will be energy efficient, right? The brain consumes less than 20 watts, and also action capable, right? They're not just telling you whether it's a cat or a dog on an image, right? It actually is performing some action in a closed loop. And I think that's very, very promising, although yet undeveloped. And finally, I want to thank the people who were originally developed in this theoretical development. And I want to thank you all for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mitya, for this very interesting, thought-provoking, I would say, like especially for someone with my background at least, alternative and fresh view of the experimental findings as well. Let me go ahead and post the Zoom room link in case people want to join us already, because like at some point we will be going offline and continuing in the Zoom room. If you would like, you can also stop screen sharing for the time being. So one question I have, if I understand things correctly, like with this new DDDC framework, you kind of obviate the need to, like for the neuron to estimate the parameters like A, B, and C. So this makes it first more biologically realistic, but also less computationally intensive for the mathematical side of things, right? And I was wondering if it could also like go into an even more focused direction in the sense like, this started from networks down to the neuron, now that you implemented the single neuron level, if it can go to the dendritic subcompartments of a neuron, because we know there's a lot of diversity, apical dendrites, soma, and so on. If you could model each individual compartment as a DDDC device.
That's a great question. I think you're right. I think that in the end, we would want to see every synapse as a DDDC controller, not just a neuron. And then, of course, all the synapses and dendrites, they somehow have to come together to produce a neuron as a DDC controller. Just like the neurons have to come together to produce a concerted action of a brain nucleus or brain area that come together and produce a concerted action of the brain as a whole.
But for the time being, this would run into the same problem of how do you integrate into a network all these DDDC devices, right?
Exactly. And that's what I would call the million-dollar question here.
Right. Okay. And then like in a parallel to what you are already doing, like explaining findings, current findings, could you like try to implement it at the subcompartment to explain the dendritic findings? Like with people saying that dendrites can compute so much, can you explain some of these behaviors, like dendritic behaviors, with this model?
I hope so. I hope so. We haven't done it, but I think that's a promising approach.
Right. Thank you very much. There are people saying thank you in the chat. I'm conveying this because you cannot see it for the time being. And as there are people already joining us here, I think I have another question. And if there are no questions appearing in the chat, we can also continue offline because I'm sure people want to engage in a conversation with you. Would you like to go ahead and ask a question?
There's only 4 of us here now, right? I think on Zoom. Yeah.
People are still moving in and out because we are still broadcasting. So
Hi, Toby.
Oh, I see. I think the last time I saw you was in Cold Spring Harbor or something. Anyway, so this is I wanted to join this talk because, a regular participant in our Telluride workshop the last few years has been Rodolph Sepulcher. Do you know him? He's at Cambridge. He's a control theory guy, and he got interested in how neurons control themselves and how they improve their spike timing and so on. Have you heard of that work that he's been doing?
I'm sorry, I haven't heard. I haven't.
Rodolph Sepulcher. Yeah, Rodolph Sepulcher.
Okay, no,
and
I don't.
He was brought to.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Yeah, he was brought to Telluride.
Lecture. Yes.
Yeah, he's brought to Telluride by John Doyle, who has now been working for years and years on stuff like system level synthesis. It's a framework for distributed control, which is obviously interesting for brains and stuff like that. I think you guys should all talk to each other and argue.
Absolutely. I just watched his lecture, and I think it's relevant. Yes.
And he gave a very nice lecture, I believe, at Telluride, or somehow it was recorded part of the Telluride. I can share you the link to this lecture, which maybe I believe it was a Telluride lecture that was recorded. No, I could be wrong about that. I don't follow it that closely, because this control theory stuff is beyond me, right? We're very much more practical for control.
So before I thank you, Mitya, for this talk, let me maybe ask another question before we also stop the live broadcast and continue here, given that people are gathering. So one question I have is biologically, how do you imagine this being implemented? Is there a developmental process that will allow the network to grow into realizing what is the optimal control state for its neuron?
Yeah, I think so. It's just like an exploration versus exploitation trade-off. The neurons have to constantly probe their environment and then listen to the response that they get. And that has to happen all the time. And I think that's what spontaneous activity in the brain is. And it should also, of course, happen in development, because otherwise they don't know what's out there. Nobody's telling any given neuron what to do, right? There is no centralized authority. So they have to figure things out by themselves, and the only way they can do is that tickle the system and hear the response.
Yeah, I'm just imagining that the mappings between observations and control actions would change, from a developmental situation to a more mature neural system that I now need to survive like this, because the end objective of the organisms change.
Oh, yeah. No, I think if I understand correctly, you're pointing out that the dynamics of the environment is constantly changing, and the controllers have to adapt to that change.
Yeah, and discard some of the mappings. like from the
Absolutely.
matrix.
And
Okay.
yeah, absolutely. And in fact, our sort of biggest hope for experimental smoking gun for this is to do an experiment like that, where you can manipulate the dynamics of the environment and watch the neuron adapt as a controller would to that manipulation.
I see.
You mean manipulate the solution concentration of salt or something, or
anything to manipulate the loop so that, and to
okay.
see that the controller would adapt to that manipulation. For example, you may be able to drive a neuron to favor some crazy pattern, right? If you reward the neuron when it produces a certain pattern, bump bump of spikes, you keep rewarding it by some kind of feedback, then the neuron will just keep doing that. And so that, I think, would be a strong indication that this framework is useful.
I think it's time to take it offline then and continue here and stop broadcasting. So at this point, I would like to thank you again for this fantastic talk, Mitya. And yeah, like the audience can click on the link and join us here. Some people are already here. Thank you again.
Thank you.